On the morning of the 14th of February 2026, the Swedish Coast Guard boarded an oil tanker in the Baltic. She was flying the flag of Palau, she was carrying 23,000 tons of Russian crude, and she had spent stretches of the voyage with her transponder switched off. Her paperwork did not say where the oil had come from. Her insurance certificate was fake. Sweden seized her. It was the first time a European state had done that to a ship of this kind. The Kiwala is not unusual. Since 2022, a fleet has assembled to carry oil that Western sanctions were written to restrict, made up of tankers with obscured ownership, borrowed flags, and cover that no underwriter will confirm. Estimates of its size run from 600 vessels to 1,900, and the organizations counting cannot agree because the fleet has no register, no headquarters, and no name. What they broadly agree on is the share. Somewhere between a tenth and a fifth of the world's oil tankers now belong to it. Boarding a tanker at sea is what you do when everything else has failed. For 3 years, the West had something quieter, and it never needed a warship at all. The fleet is difficult to count because it is not a thing that can be counted. There is no company, no state program, no register to consult, and no owner to ask. What exists is a loose ecosystem of shell firms, traders, small registries, and non-Western insurers, and a tanker joins it or leaves it by behavior rather than by paperwork. A vessel that switches off its transponder, meets another ship in open water, and files documents omitting where its cargo came from is behaving like part of it. One that does none of those things is not. So the number depends on where the line is drawn. Windward, a maritime intelligence firm, tracks around 1,900 vessels. The brokers at Clarksons put it near 1,800, of which roughly 1,500 are tankers. Analysts working from a tighter definition count 600 to 800. The Ukrainian government identifies a hard core of about 400 tankers that have made 3 or more voyages from Russian ports. Every one of those figures is defensible. A fleet defined by what it conceals cannot be inventoried. The ships themselves are less mysterious. Most are elderly, and 4 years ago most were Western-owned. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, European and American owners began disposing of tonnage that was about to become a liability. Tankers approaching the end of their working lives, hard to charter and harder to insure once the sanctions arrived. There were buyers, most of them companies with a single ship on their books, and ownership structures nobody could see through. In the months following the invasion, roughly 600 vessels moved into that world. Since then, the fleet has about tripled, which brings up something that sounds implausible until you look at what was actually said at the time. The West was not trying to stop Russian oil. Russia supplied around a tenth of the world's crude. Taking that volume off the market would have driven prices up everywhere, during an inflation crisis in the year after a pandemic. The concern in Washington was a global price shock and a global recession, including in countries that had nothing to do with the war. So the policy was built to do 2 things at once: keep the oil moving, and stop the seller being paid full price for it. The instrument was a price cap, and its principal advocate was the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, an economist arguing for a measure that introductory economics says should not work. Price caps normally distort supply and discourage producers. This one was designed around a specific asymmetry. Russia's cost of pumping and moving oil was far below the market price, so a ceiling could sit well under world prices and still leave selling worthwhile. From December 2022, the G7, the European Union and Australia agreed that Russian crude could still move on Western-linked shipping, insurance and finance, provided it had been sold at $60 a barrel or less. Above that line, the services were withdrawn, not a blockade. A condition. A condition has to attach to something, and oil will not cooperate. A barrel gives no indication of what was paid for it, so the price cannot be verified by inspecting the cargo. Enforcement had to reach into the transaction instead, through somebody in the chain who would answer to Western regulators. The whole policy rested on finding the right somebody. Stopping the ships was never available, and the reason is older than the sanctions. A merchant vessel on the high seas answers to one authority only: the state whose flag she flies, not the state she sailed from, not the state she is heading to, and not whichever navy happens to be nearby. Another country's warship may not board her without permission from that flag state, and doing it anyway is not a customs dispute. It is an intrusion on another state's jurisdiction. There are exceptions, and they are narrow. A warship may stop a vessel it reasonably suspects of piracy, of slave trading, of broadcasting illegally, or of having no nationality at all. Hold on to that last one. Sanctioning the buyers fails for a different reason. India and China never joined the price cap coalition and were under no obligation to. Both became major purchasers of discounted Russian crude, and no rule written in Brussels or Washington reaches a refinery in Gujarat. What the coalition did control was something far less visible than a navy. Almost every ocean-going tanker on Earth carried liability cover from the same small cluster of mutual associations, the P&I clubs, most of them anchored in London and between them ensuring something close to 90% of world tonnage. That concentration matters because of a rule made after the tanker disasters of the 1960s and 70s. Under the International Convention on Oil Pollution, the owner of any tanker carrying more than 2,000 tons of cargo is liable for spill damage whether or not anyone was at fault, and must hold a certificate proving the cover exists. Every port checks it. So does every canal, and so does every charterer before putting cargo aboard. A tanker without that certificate is not breaking any law. She is simply a ship that nowhere on Earth will let alongside. So the coalition had its choke point, and it required no warships and no territory. Sell Russian crude above $60 a barrel and the insurance disappears, taking the ports and the canals with it. A rule drafted in London and Washington could reach every ocean without a single ship being stopped. It was probably the most elegant sanction ever designed, and it rested on an assumption nobody had needed to question: that the certificate meant something. What a port official actually inspects is a document stating that a named insurer covers a named vessel. Nobody telephones London to confirm it. For a century there was no reason to forge one, because the forgery bought you nothing. You would still be uninsured the first time something went wrong, and the liability would destroy you. For a company that owns one ship, holds it through a shell in a country with no disclosure requirements, and would walk away from the vessel rather than pay a claim, that logic stops applying. Investigators tracing certificates carried by shadow fleet tankers have found insurers that do not exist. One provider named on the paperwork of more than 20 vessels listed a contact number belonging to a private individual in Germany with no connection to shipping. Its website went offline within weeks of being written about, which raises the obvious problem. A fake certificate might get a ship into a port. It cannot give her a nationality. Every vessel needs a flag, and a flag has to be issued by a country. A flag is the legal nationality of a ship. It decides whose rules she sails under, which inspectors may board her, and whose courts hear the case when something goes wrong. Countries sell them, and that is neither new nor illegal. Panama and Liberia have run open registries for decades, taking ships from owners anywhere in the world, and between them they flagged a large share of the global fleet. The practice is old enough and ordinary enough that most of the shipping industry depends on it. At the bottom of that market, investigators have found things that should not be possible. 24 sanctioned tankers were recorded flying the flag of Malawi, a landlocked country whose shipping registrar appears not to exist. Vessels have turned up under the flag of Eswatini, also landlocked, which has no registry of any kind. The Cook Islands, running its registry through a private company, accumulated around 800 ships, including more than 30 that Western governments had already blacklisted. Cameroon's registry, once respectable and carrying over 500 vessels, admitted widespread fraud and closed in February 2026. A ship flying a flag that no country actually issued may not have a false nationality. She may have none, and a vessel without nationality is one of the few things a warship may lawfully board on the high seas. Nobody has really tested that yet. The detentions so far have relied on coastal state powers and document offenses, in waters where those states already had authority. But the registry fraud has left an opening in international law that Western governments have not walked through, and lawyers have started arguing they should. Finding the ships is a separate problem. Every large vessel carries a transponder broadcasting its identity and position continuously, which is how the maritime world knows where anything is. It can be switched off, and ships in this trade go dark for stretches of a voyage. Increasingly, they do something more sophisticated, broadcasting false coordinates or another ship's identity. So a tanker loading off the Russian coast appears on every screen to be somewhere else entirely. Lloyd's List Intelligence recorded a sharp rise in the practice through 2025. Once two ships can meet unobserved, the cargo's history can be erased. In the Gulf of Oman and in waters off Malaysia, tankers transfer oil to one another in the open sea, so that crude loaded in Russia reaches the refinery aboard a vessel that has never been near a Russian port. Blend two cargoes together and the oil has no traceable origin at all. The enforcement response has been substantial on paper. The European Union had designated around 600 vessels by early 2026 and adds more every month. The United States sanctioned 183 ships in a single action in January 2025 and has now listed roughly 40% of the fleet. What designation achieves is harder to see. By early 2026, 623 tankers had been designated by at least one government and 111 of them were still loading Russian cargo. Sanctioned tankers now carry around 68% of Russia's crude exports. Being on the list has become a description of the trade rather than an obstacle to it. So the fleet has won the argument. It moves the oil, the money arrives, and 4 years of listings have not materially changed either. It is also falling apart. 96% of the crude tankers in this trade are more than 15 years old, and 92% of the product tankers. That is not an accident of the market. These ships were bought precisely because they were near the end of their working lives, and therefore cheap. And they have now spent 4 more years running hard, without Western insurers inspecting them and without the maintenance regime that insurance normally enforces. One of the largest ship recycling firms in the world puts it plainly. At least a third of the tankers carrying Russian oil should be scrapped immediately. More than half may be at risk. These tankers sail everywhere, out of Russian Pacific ports, out of the Black Sea, carrying Iranian and Venezuelan oil as well. But the sharpest version of the problem is the Baltic, because the Baltic is shallow, crowded, and reachable from the Atlantic only through a narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden. Finland's border guard has estimated that 70 to 80 loaded tankers leave Russian ports through the Gulf of Finland every week, many crewed by people with little experience of winter navigation. The record is already there. Satellite monitoring has confirmed at least 9 oil spills from Shadow Fleet vessels since 2021. In December 2024, 2 Russian tankers aged 52 and 55 years broke apart in a storm in the Kerch Strait and released somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 tons of heavy fuel oil, contaminating more than 60 kilometers of coastline. In October 2025, another lost engine power and grounded in the Suez Canal. When a conventional tanker spills, a machine starts turning. The owner is known. The insurer is liable whether or not anyone was at fault. Claims are filed, assessed and paid, because that liability was the price of the ship being allowed into port at all. Almost none of that survives contact with this fleet. The owner is a shell holding one vessel in a country that publishes nothing. The insurer may not exist. The flag may have come from a registry that has since admitted it was fraudulent. The bill, though, does not disappear. Above the ship owner's liability sits a second layer, the international compensation funds, which exist precisely for the case where an owner cannot or will not pay. They will cover something in the region of 200 million euros, and they are financed by contributions from the companies that receive oil by sea, refiners and traders in the countries that ratified the conventions, which means the cleanup after an untraceable tanker breaks up on a European coast is paid for by the part of the industry that never left the system. The fund's own secretariat has been raising this at its meetings in London for 2 years now, without much sign of an answer. The price cap moved a substantial share of the world's tankers outside the rules. The costs are still finding their way back in.